Yeah, so we've got a series of slides that we're going to go through, and we'll talk to the slides, and we're going to talk for, I don't know, roughly half an hour, 40 minutes, I should think, and then we'll have plenty of time for talking afterwards and questions and any other sort of business afterwards. When we were the two of us were thinking about this meeting, this workshop, we were wondering about what headings to put our thoughts into. And we've come up with these three, which is the commonalities. So what might be considered the universal aspects of the approach across different cultures and places? What are the things that are distinctive, that will have a distinctiveness that is that varies between the different settings, and what things need careful consideration, and then what lessons we've learned. So Viv and I, in July and early August, we spent 5 weeks together touring around the North Island of New Zealand, working in various schools in different settings, and Viv might tell you much more about those things than I will. And so this is really a kind of where we are at this point, thinking about what happened to us and what all the sorts of things that happen in classrooms and all the particular challenges that appeared in different places. And we've tried to summarize them, and then we're going to talk about what we have learned in response to that. So I'm going to just tell you briefly about myself, and then I'm going to hand over to Viv for the next bit. So this is me. So I've been a teacher for 25 years, worked in primary, secondary and adult education. I've been a visiting lecturer at Newcastle University since 2001. I'm the author of Beginner's Guide to Mantle the Expert and the conveyor of mantletheexpert.com. And I've taught in a number of countries. There's a list. And as I said, I've just come back from a tour of New Zealand working with Viv. Over to you, Viv.
Kia ora koutou, ko Chosen Hill to Maunga, ko River 7 to Awa, ko Tom taku papa, ko Rosemary Aitken taku mama, ko Papaioia te kainga, ko Viv Aitken aho. Now, I shared that very brief little version of a New Zealand Māori pepeha just to kind of illustrate our point here, really. Because if we were in certain settings in New Zealand, it would be kind of a bit odd to start with your name. It would be a bit odd to not to start with a reference to your mountain, your river, the land that you call home, your mother, your father, all those other things, and then to finish with your name. That's just a norm. That's just how it's done in some settings in New Zealand. And I think that sort of really illustrates what we're talking about today, because certain settings that I teach in, it wouldn't feel as though we'd started today unless we'd done karakia, a prayer, and each done our pepeha and introduced ourselves to each other. So I mean, that isn't weird and different, that is normal. So today's meeting would feel a bit weird and different to some of the people I work with. But yeah, this is me. Hello. I was gonna, in my CV, I usually say that I've worked in education for 30 years, but I didn't want to sound like I was older than Tim. These are some of the things I've done, and yeah, it was a great pleasure to host Tim around New Zealand recently, and there was lots that we learned in the process. And I was joking with David and Tim that our heading, the realities of Mantle around the world, just sounds so assertive, as PowerPoints often do, but the reality is that this is a PowerPoint about our thinking about some of the stuff we've done in different settings.
So these are some of the things that we've noticed in our travels and the different places that we've worked that I'm sure will be very, very familiar to you. But I think that they're important because they're kind of foundational ideas, and they are obviously the things that Dorothy understood and built her whole kind of a different approaches upon. So these are the things, if in the different classrooms that I've worked in, I once worked in a classroom on the side of a mountain in Palestine with an Arabic translator, with a with about 7 or 8 children that were in that classroom, and all these things were there were loads and loads of things, obviously, that were very different about our sort of cultural experiences and the things that we knew about. But these were the things that we held in common. So one of them is that we are amazing, have this superpower of imagination, and that this is the greatest resource, I believe, that we have in the classroom. And it's infinite, it's free, and you can draw on it as much as you like, and it's there all the time. So we are, as human beings, creative creatures, and we strive to make meaning, and the meaning that we make, we want to represent in various forms. The third is that we have inquiring minds. We're curious and inquisitive, and particularly about things that we only partially or entirely don't understand. We want to find out more, and we strive for that. And the fourth thing is that we're playful, and all human beings that that I know can play. We know how to play, and drama is a form of play, and using various conventions, and the conventions allow us to hold time and make meaning. So here's something I think that people who are familiar with this way of working, we see boys who want to, they want to do rough and tumble play. They want to, if you're going to be doing stuff around conflict, and particularly in this regard, it was a set of people who was creating a settlement, and then they were under threat from the outside, and there's a battle, and these boys know how to play. You don't have to teach them that, but the conventions here, as you can see, allow this play to become meaningful, because you can hold time, you can look at it, you can explore it, and you can build on it. So these commonalities, these things, are the things that we found were true in all the settings that we have worked in.
And before I move on to distinctiveness, as you were talking there, Tim, I was thinking about other commonalities too.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I just thought of another one. I was listening to a podcast the other day about status, and how status is something, and the wishing to score points, and that sounds really awful, but wishing to score points and succeed with other humans, it's not just a game we play, but it's actually hardwired right into our psyche. So I think the aspect of Mantle of the Expert that's around positioning and power is also something that's universal. And I'm sure there are other things we could write about too, but I'm going to talk here about distinctiveness, and Tim doesn't mind me mentioning this, but when Tim first provided this slide, he talked about difference, and I hope you can see why I've changed that to distinctiveness, because one of the things we have to watch is that when we move from familiar settings to unfamiliar settings, we don't use that universal trait of humans to go us and them and say the different is other settings. Different settings that we are not familiar with are not different or other, they're distinct, and every setting has its own cultural sensibilities, norms, and even worldviews. That sense of course is different in different settings, and that is that becomes more clear the further from one's own culture one is working in. So I think it's impossible as a teacher working in an unfamiliar culture to ever assume a full understanding of those cultural differences. It's one of the ironies of drama that we can we talk to our children as if we can take on another person's point of view and look through their eyes and be them. We can't. We can represent them. We can have a think about what it might be to be us with our cultural sensibilities and norms in that situation. But it is also really important that we realize that there are others, there are people other than ourselves who have completely different sensibilities, norms, worldviews, ways of seeing what's going on. There's lots of ways of being normal. So this is a photo of a young man playing a dead body, and that's a situation in New Zealand that carries a whole lot of different connotations than would have done in the classroom in the UK. There's also sensibilities about the way we would work with a young man in this situation. We wouldn't step over him, for example. It's not even something I would have thought about when I was teaching in England. So how do you get your head around that? You get guidance. If you're working in a culture that's not your own, a cultural guide, someone to whisper in your ear, say, hey, have you thought about that? I think is the only way you can do it, because you don't want to get paralyzed, but you also just need to be aware, very aware, and appreciate those sensibilities. So yeah, sorry, if you can bring up the next point, Tim. The other thing is core knowledge and experience. And I think those of us who are teaching, well, I was just about to do it and generalize. I have found that teaching young people today, there's less of a shared core knowledge of certain stories and things like that, even within one culture. But it's really important that we don't assume that the things that are part of our own core knowledge and experience are the same for children in any setting, certainly not in a context that's not our own. So teaching here in New Zealand, yeah, you can't just assume that children have all experienced Goldilocks and I can't even think of some of the other ones now, but neither can you assume that if you're in a classroom full of Māori children, they all know the cultural legends of their region. There will be some core knowledge and experience there, but it's going to be their own. So it's those assumptions we make, isn't it, that we have to shift past. Hey, basically, when I pause, Tim, just we'll do the next one.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say something off the back of that, really. That
yeah,
this was something that it did take me a while to really appreciate. So Viv was telling me these things before I was coming out, and I was sort of thinking about some of the context that we might do together. But it was only really once I was out there and Viv said about having a guide, that she was guiding me all the time and sort of checking that and saying, yeah, you might want to rethink that, because that isn't something that you can rely on. So there were an awful lot of these kind of cultural or core knowledge sort of things that I was taking for granted, that all the time were being put under the test.
And I think on that, Tim, the thing is that non-European cultures, or even non-Eurocentric cultures, and I include white New Zealand in that, we spend a lot of time code shifting and understanding that an English facilitator, a facilitator from England or from America, those sort of dominant Eurocentric cultures, are going to do some stuff, and we're going to go, oh right, that's part, so we spend a lot of time code shifting, and Māori people would say they spend a lot of time code shifting all over again. Minority women spend time code shifting, going, oh okay, he's doing a man thing there. But I think when you're a teacher from the dominant worldview, you kind of don't necessarily realize that's going on. So it's very interesting for for someone from a dominant culture to experience that thing where their norms are not the norm. And so, if you say to kids in New Zealand, all right, can you just sit up on the desks? They're not going to do that. You don't sit on desks. It's a yuck here in New Zealand to sit on a table. So it can be kind of humbling, but it's also an insight into how people who live in minority cultures are doing that cultural shift all the time, and feeling that sort of slight ick, and I don't quite know how to read this situation. Right. And I want to say, can I say something now, which is that it feels really odd to me to be presenting and speaking for Māori culture and New Zealand culture when I'm not Indigenous myself. And I would never normally do this. I would always, as you know, if you've worked with me before, if I'm talking about this world, I would invite a colleague from that world along with me. That principle of nothing about me without me is really important. Unfortunately, my colleague who I often co-present with, Whakarongo Tauranga, wasn't able to join us today, but that's a really important principle as well of not, not doing what I'm doing right now and speaking for another culture. So I guess all I can claim here is that I'm speaking from my worldview about my experiences of what I've seen there. So yeah, knowledge, culture, and rituals and routines. I think rituals and routines is the symptom of those other things. That's the place where you see the cultural difference and the knowledge differences coming out. That it's like the symptom of those deeper worldview differences. That's all I'd say on that. I think really it's important to know the rituals and routines of another setting, or at least be open to talking overtly about those and working out what they were. I mean, one of the things Tim was really great at was asking children, right, what do we do here? How do we move in and out here? How do we open the space? How do we close the space? What do you do when you want to get, speak? And on the whole, I think you found a lot more informal in New Zealand, didn't you, than in the British contexts that you'd worked with. Huge generalization, but would that be right, Tim?
Yeah, I think one of the things that are important for me about this dimension was that you have communities, obviously, that across borders and through countries and with different cultures and different ways of doing things, but you also have them within schools and settings. So I spend a great deal of my time traveling to different schools and working in different schools. And a school in Sussex on Monday. And that even within schools, even within classrooms, you can have different routines and conventions and ways of doing things. And these are rules. These are things that define that community. And so I think what the point of this point that we're highlighting here is that some of these things aren't across borders. They can be from one room to the next, or one school to the next. And as Viv says, one of the principles is, for me anyway, is to ask, how are things done here? Because the people who know are the people in that community. If it's a classroom, will be the children. So if you want to find out how things are done, you ask the kids, which of course is the principle of Mantle the expert. They're the experts, so they're the best people to ask. So rather than sort of coming in and saying, well, this is how I do things, and putting that over, their culture, it's more a place of, well, how do I find my place in this classroom? How can I, and then finding yourself in there. So the formality and the informality is partly to do with that. So as Viv says, and it is a generalization to say schools in the UK, but generally speaking, schools in the UK are more formal settings than the schools that I encountered in New Zealand. But there were several schools in New Zealand which were more informal than others. And it's one of the other dimensions of the work that we do through dramatic inquiry is the facility to create imaginary or fictional settings that require different forms of formality. So if you were working in a school, as we were, in one place in particular, where it was a very informal place, the classrooms were very informal. The children tended to sort of be very relaxed and moved around in an informal way. And the children were actually finding it difficult to use formal forms of behaviour that were required in the setting that we were creating. So it was an opportunity to talk to them about that, about that, the fact that sometimes, like if you go into a church and there's a ceremony, it requires a certain kinds of formality. Or if you're meeting, say, if you were meeting a king or something like that, you would behave in particular kinds of way. So that social settings require certain different kinds of behaviour. So that was something that well, it's something that we found as we were going around, that there was lots of opportunities to do that. You want to talk about this first one? This is probably more.
Sure. So we haven't really talked either about content and about the interesting things that arise when you know one wants to work with content that's from a context other than your own. And one of the things we talked about in last year's panel, I remember, David, was the sensitivities around that, and the growing sensitivity, I think, around the world about drawing, you know, at what the difference between cultural appreciation and cultural assimilation, and trying to get that right. So I remember in last year's panel talking about how to get past that sense of paralysis, and how to get advice on which you know, on how there's a cultural take, or there might be a different cultural view, even on things like drama conventions, even on notions of things like embodiment, which might feel quite different to there we go again, which in my experience, I have had cultural advice from one cultural advisor in New Zealand that embodying someone else isn't always an appropriate or respectful thing to do. So that's a really interesting provocation for drama. So in response to all of that, Tim and I have started working together on creating some sequences and then running them by people, certainly in our own contexts, for that sort of cultural take and cultural advice. So the book that's about to appear, I hope, on the right here, the book called Try This, that Tim and I have created together, sort of attempts to draw some of this together and present these short sequences of dramatic activity, dramatic inquiry activity, and each one has been run past and explored with a cultural advisor from this setting only, but we hope that having that input from an Indigenous pair of eyes and Indigenous worldview in New Zealand may offer some advice and some new thoughts for teachers around the world. So I should name who that person was. Our cultural advisor here in New Zealand was someone called Warren Warbrick, who is Rangatani Māori. And getting his views on what we were writing was really revealing. Again, it's not a case of trying to understand or adopt those, but just take that counsel about things like how to embody a historical figure, how to whether to embody a historical figure. Anyway, I'm blathering, but all those conversations helped us come up with certain principles and ways of working and boundaries to put around things like embodiment, and we've baked those into the keys in this book. I think drawing on our own experience wouldn't have been enough, so having that external cultural advice, not that we're claiming it's going to be the same all over the world. In fact, last time we met, I remember David, what's the name of the lovely lady from India who was in our panel last year?
Vaishali.
Vaishali, thank you. I remember Vaishali saying, we embody gods all the time in India, and we poke fun at them. And so the point is not that there's one way of working with Indigenous material, but the process of asking people who might know the cultural sensibilities is an important one. Sorry, I feel like I've blathered for 25 minutes on one bullet point there.
No, I don't think you do. I think that, no, you weren't blathering. It's quite a difficult thing to put into words, and I think you did a really good job, because I remember, you know, this wasn't something that had occurred to me at all, because for me, there's distance. There's a distance between the character, the historical figure, or the mythological figure, and the representation that I'm making of that character. So that, for me, that was where I found the conceptualization of it. But you made me, through this conversation that you were having, it made me think about it in a very different way. It reframed it, and then made me think to myself, well, am I making an awful lot of assumptions here? And I'd never thought about it before. So it was a provocation, it was a challenge to say, well, look, every time you do this, can you do this? Should you do this? I can represent anybody if I want to, but should I? Is the question that I should be asking myself every time I do it.
Because it turns out that even those universals that we put in the first slide, they're universal, but there's distinctiveness even around what those mean or how those feel, and whether those apply. So what imagination is, what embodiment is, what theatre and drama are, what they're for, what a human being is, what bits of a human being are sacred and not to be, not to be messed with, is going to be different according to your worldview, really. And we can't know all of those, but we need to know that they could be so, and not just go in there with a blunt instrument going, right, let's, it's like the first conversation I had on this ever was with a beautiful teacher who turned around to me and said, I wouldn't be doing that in my classroom. And what I was doing was I was going into role as Tawhiri Mātea, the god of the wind. And there was plenty of stories about Tawhiri Mātea, the god of the wind, but I had an interaction that happened, and she said, oh, I wouldn't do that in my, not for my class. She said it very gently, and I said, oh, tell me more. And she said, well, would you ring up God? And it was like, okay. This is the beginning of a really important conversation. So yeah, as someone says in the chat here, how do we define imagination? It's going to depend. That's totally culturally defined, and it means different things. And particularly with cultures where there's a sacred element to these things, the sacredness about parts of the body, about the human spirit. Those are important to understand and not waddle all over. But the secret is to include people in the conversations and the planning. Just change. I remember the last time we were talking about this, someone said in the chat quite rightly, well, how are we supposed to know what to do? And my response was, enlarge the we, so that we have people in the group who are doing the planning and the thinking, who do know what to do. And if you can't find the we yet, well, wait till you can find them. Yeah. So
no, I think that's important as well, because that was something that I felt initially. I felt, oh, this is binding me. This is restricting me. This is preventing me from doing things, from using ideas that I rely on, that I regularly use. I think, oh, these things work, and then I had to sort of think to myself, well, I can't do that. I can't do that. I can't do that. I can't do that. So you could end up going, oh, this isn't going to work. This isn't something that's going to work in this context. But actually, what it did, and the longer we worked together, the more and more this became apparent, is it opened up all kinds of avenues of things that I hadn't considered before. Because it was like saying, well, okay, well, we'll have to find another way of doing it. And you'd think, okay, well, how am I going to do that? And then we'd work it out, and it would work.
Sorry, Tim. It brings a whole. I think. I'm looking at Brian here, and the one thing I know about Brian is he loves teasing out nuances of things and re-theorizing things. And I think for example, bringing the cultural lens that Warren brought on embodiment really allowed me to re-theorize embodiment a new way, and think about, oh, okay, there's this way of thinking about it, and there's this way of thinking about it. And with advice, we've been able to, Warren and I have also worked on some programs for the local museum that are teaching Mātauranga Māori, so Māori traditions and histories and worldviews, and they're really drawing on the best of those strengths and being supported by the best of dramatic inquiry. And sure, I've had to compromise on some of my stuff. He's had to compromise a little bit on some of his stuff, but I would say that in the dance between those two, in that context anyway, the Mātauranga Māori had to come first. So if he said it's not a situation for full role, I went, okay, well, what about this? And I'm going to be honest, the more we asserted the cultural needs, the more aesthetic the drama became. So that's another thing. Sometimes our assumed tools are a bit, maybe that the aesthetic is another common human experience that we can tap into by making slightly different choices, more informed choices. And sure, if you feel a bit of white fragility as your tried and tested ways of working are affronted, fine, it's our turn. People have been feeling culturally fragile from the other direction for a long, long time.
We'll move on to the next one.
Yeah. So I think we talked about that one really, but I would say if you want to get one process right, it's nothing about me without me. If you're working with Indigenous material, if you're a man and you're writing a drama about women, if you're a woman and you're writing a drama about men, anything where you're working across cultures or understandings or worldviews or experiences, nothing about me without me. But our book does still incorporate these aspects that appear to be universal. And having said all that about, oh, be careful of this and be careful of that, what we've done is create these sequences that do have step-by-step methods that bake in these sensitivities and understandings as well as we can. And it seems to be working. Teachers are really enjoying the book and enjoying the sense of security that they get from exploring these sequences. What's different between, I think you should talk about this, Tim, what's different between what we call the keys in the book and conventions is that the keys are sequences that build intrigue and then use things like the 6 dimensions of dramatic imagination and model inductive language and those kinds of things. So if you think about what a key is, it's a way of unlocking a door and letting you into a new context. And in order to use the key, if you look at the key, it's got lots of bumps and ridges and fancy bits on it that are really important to how it works, but you don't need to have to cut the key in order to use it. So it's a little bit like that for the teachers. They don't need to know what those different activities and inflections and steps and sequences are for. They just need to sort of trust them and use them and adapt them. So you want to talk a bit more about
the important that we've tried to avoid as much as possible. It kind of builds, David, a little bit on the conversation we were having last week about how to reach out to people beyond our community and entice them into dramatic inquiry. And we talked a little bit about the risk that was involved in doing that. And one of the things that we tried to do in the book, and this is something obviously that people have been trying to do for countless years, is to try and make it accessible in a way that doesn't make it technical. So that the technical things that are going on, a bit like, as Viv says, the making of a key, you don't need to understand how to make a key to use a key. Somebody else has done that job. You don't have to know about anything about locks. There's clever people have designed locks and made the locks. You don't have to understand how they work in order to turn a key and open a door. So this metaphor that we've used is we've tried to create as 40 of these activities, if you like, 40 sequences. Well, they can be put together into sequences as well. That we hope people who both know how to use dramatic inquiry and understand some of the components about dramatic inquiry, the technical components of dramatic, the conventions of dramatic action and inductive language and other things, that they'll be able to use this book, but also we're hoping that it will reach people who perhaps don't have that technical understanding. So people who are at the beginning of their journey, and it will be a kind of an entry point for them. We've got to. We won't. I think we should stop now, Viv, and open the conversation up. But as Viv said, there's another set of slides, another 10 or so slides that go into more detail in how the book works, and there's some examples in there as well. And we've given that PowerPoint to David, and he'll share it with you in a day or so. We've just got to check one of the photographs to make sure we're not using a photograph of a student who their parents would rather not they were not in it. So, but David will send that out to everybody who wants a copy, and then you'll be able to read a little bit more about the book. And if you visit the website, it's called trythisbook.org. There's lots of information on there, and other resources and other things, and it'll be growing quickly. I'm not going to say exponentially because that would be ridiculous. It will be growing quickly.
Overclaim.
It would be an overclaim, yes. Over the next couple of years.
We have people from around the world here today, so I'm keen to open it up to them to talk about the realities maybe and the resonances of what you're saying in terms of what they're doing. Just a couple of quick questions from me. So from what you were saying at the end there, I'm just thinking about how both of you came to write this book after having written the books on Mantle of the Expert. Was there some sense for you of teachers maybe you're working with who might be concerned or anxious about using drama, put up by this word drama, and that you're trying to reach out to them? Some people who might find Mantle of the Expert. I mean, I know Richard has talked about how the term itself can put some people off. So are you trying to reach out to non-drama specialists, say?
I'll say something. I know Viv's got something to say about this as well, but very quickly, I think this what we're trying to do is to create a guidebook on how to create activities in the classroom, and that Mantle of the Expert is built into this. But you don't need to even know what the term Mantle of the Expert in order to do it. But if you do, then you'll be able to use these activities to create sessions in the classroom and sequences. And that for me was the bit that was missing. That bit of how, when you come to do the planning, you do the overview, the client, the commission, the team, and the setting up the context. But what do you actually do at the interface when you go into the classroom? What guidance is there that you can find in the community? So there's planning. There's planning on the Mantle of the Expert website. But what if you want to plan your own? They're a little bit like recipes. So you can as you get a recipe book off your shelf, and somebody who knows how to cook has created, written this recipe, you follow it, and they've got something that you might like to eat. That's really what I hope it's fulfilling that step in the process.
Viv, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I'm reflecting honestly on your question, David. Tim and I did write we did write some fairly comprehensive books on Mantle of the Expert, and I'm really proud of that book. And yes, in retrospect, I think this book might be deliberately kind of accessible in comparison to that book, which was more kind of like, here's everything I know. Here's everything I know and what I think about this. It was more a theoretical book, although I hope it's also practical. We deliberately set out to make it undense, this one, and accessible, and yeah, I think Tim's covered it in terms of how it fits with Mantle of the Expert. I'm going to be honest. You said, were you trying to reach out to non-drama specialists? I spend my entire life with classroom teachers who don't consider themselves to know or understand or be anything to do with drama. It's that's one of the reasons I left academia, really. I loved working in the drama and education field with specialists, with experts who lived and talked and breathed my language. But I particularly love working with classroom teachers whose thing is teaching kids. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. And none of those people would see themselves as a drama person. They now see themselves as someone who uses dramatic inquiry, but in their minds those two things are quite different. And I do my best to say, no, this is drama, but that, you know, this has been a long conversation, hasn't it, about what that obstacle is for people. It's like the world of play, people who work in play, that there's an obstacle that sort of culturally people have about making play something to do with learning. So I'll be honest, the book came about because I was talking to Tim one day and I was saying, I've got to teach, I want to help these teachers teach this thing. How should I do it? And he said, well, I did something yesterday with the Roman gladiators. And I was like, Tim, I can't teach the Roman gladiators. I'm in New Zealand. He said, bear with me. The sequence, listen to the sequence. And I listened to the sequence. I thought about the content that I was going to teach and I thought that's going to work. And so I sort of said, have you got any more of those? And between us, we came up with 40 sort of ways of working that weren't about the content. They were about these universals and I think one of the things the teachers that I'm working with really appreciate is that the keys are called things like step into a moment, or encounter someone, or you know, create a settlement. So they don't need to be able to get through the drama language, the technical language of, right, first we're going to do some mapping and then we're going to use a better teacher and role and a high status. They don't need to. That's the key cutting stuff. They look at the book and they fold out the back and they go, oh, okay, well, first we're going to encounter someone and then we're going to overhear them writing, and then we might take different viewpoints, and so they can see the keys as ways to do those different things. So that's how it came about for me. It was like I wanted to give teachers who are they don't see themselves as teaching drama, they see themselves as teaching the curriculum, and they want these active, imaginative ways to access that. And the reason that we ended up with 2 examples for each key in the book was because the way I would do it in a New Zealand context was so different from what Tim was doing that one example wouldn't do.
Thanks. Yeah. And just before we open it up, there's just one more thing I'd like to talk about, because as you both know, the conference this year is focusing on conventions, and that's Dorothy's conventions, her list of 33 conventions from Signs and Portents, and other conventions that other people have introduced. I know, Tim, you did a great job with that booklet you produced in making those Dorothy's conventions accessible and graspable. Just looking at some of these keys you've got here, there seems to be an element of Dorothy's conventions here with draw a plan or overhear someone writing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody who's familiar with the both Dorothy's list and Jonathan Nealon's list is going to go, oh yeah, well, they're going to see it all over it. Of course they will, because you stand on the shoulders of giants. You know, this is not a book that's come out of nowhere. Of course, we knew what we were doing with Dorothy's list, and we were referring directly to Jonathan's book because it was such a powerful, you know, guide to, and it had been so successful in making drama strategies and conventions accessible to teachers. So yes, it is. So one of the questions we were asking ourselves is there any need for what we're doing? Well, we looked at those books and we thought, well, yes, there is something more that can be written, and that's what we've done. But yeah, the answer to your question is yes. Yours, well, you've got a copy. You look through it. I bet you see conventions all over it. Of course they are. Yeah.
Well,
that's hiding that. And I think about a conversation Brian and I had some years ago, and we thought, well, what is a convention? A convention is a familiar way of doing things. We've given that word convention this big heavy meaning in drama, but we have conventions about the way we use a knife and fork. We have conventions about, so they're familiar ways of doing things. So we can use those conventions that have been passed down through the ages. We can create new ones. So if we kind of, yeah. And when I started drama teaching, I remember when I started teaching in this approach, I remember just going, will someone just give me those just teach me all of those. Give me a list of all of those and I'll be all right. And it isn't like that, is it? Because yeah, and really, and teachers do still kind of want those lists of conventions, but I think this is slightly more than that. I wouldn't think of these as conventions, because I think there are conventions of working within these keys. So yeah, I got to think about whether I think these are conventions. If conventions are familiar ways of working, then yeah, I suppose they are in some ways.
I realized we were under time pressure, but I just had a really quick question there for Viv around the context. You said you changed the context of the sequence from Roman gladiators, and I'm just sorry, I was wondering what you changed it to, and if you note that in the book that they are interchangeable. Do you actually show where that shift
so
was?
The book, yeah, so the book, each key has 2 examples with it, so the method is the same, the steps are the same, and the context is utterly different. So you'll see that as soon as you see the book. That's kind of the
Perfect.
point. It's
because
like,
I also struggle with that. Yeah.
Yeah, what does this look like if you take content right out of it? What's the teacher doing? What steps is the teacher taking? So that's what the keys are. They're like paired. Thank you for raising that, if that wasn't clear. They're paired right down, so there's no context whatsoever, so that you can apply them to different contexts. And
Brilliant.
the book comes with Tim's context and my context, and an invitation to you to write it in your context and stick it on the website. So there's going to be a whole lot of these contexts using these keys.
I'm very excited to read it, so thank you.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, it's interesting to me, this whole question of how the content might be different, or how the methods themselves might change. We have teachers here today from Ireland, from India. There's is it Ulysses? Is that I'm pronouncing it right? Has posted in the chat about using Mantle in Mexico. So people are and Elaine from Singapore. People are using Mantle in different contexts. Vaishali's here. Vaishali, we were using your name earlier.
Oh,
So,
hi, Vaishali. Hi.
so I'm interested in people's experiences of using Mantle in different contexts, and I'd love people to join in and speak about their own experiences. So I'll open it up now to anyone who wants to come in, comment, question, talk about their own experiences. Hello.
Hi, so greetings from lovely wet Ireland,
Hi.
Dublin. It's lashing rain, so that was great session. I really enjoyed that. I suppose it's more of a comment really, and just kind of going back to what Tara was speaking about. Really, as part of the Irish curriculum, we don't really use Mantle the Expert per se. It's more like teacher and role per se. So I think what you said, Viv, is absolutely gold dust to teachers, giving them those ingredients, like to create their own recipe in their own classrooms, because that really gives them, I suppose, confidence, and it gives them ownership of their drama lessons as well, which I think is absolutely, I mean, you can't sell that really. So I think this book, I'm definitely going to get this book first of all, and I'm definitely going to try it out and use it, and even trying out different scenarios. Like, so obviously loads of culture in Ireland, so obviously like we'd have mirrors of culture, what would happen in England and the Maori culture and Scottish culture. So I'm sure there'll be lots of ideas that teachers can use in their classrooms based on that as well. So thank you very much for this. It's great.
And when you do, please visit the site and upload it, because part of this project that I'm the most excited about is seeing the different ways people use the keys in contexts from around the world. So
I think it takes the mystery.
Yeah,
it takes the mystery out of Mantle of the Expert too, as well, because I think sometimes when you read about Dorothy and Jonathan, there's so much, you associate so much expertise with it. So I think this is making it very doable, for teachers, which is great,
That's
so thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Vaishali. Hello.
Yes. Hi, Viv. Hi, Tim. Thank you for doing this year. For the last couple of years, we have been looking at the Mantle Network website, and definitely we have been referring to Jonathan's book as well to work. And there have been lessons that we have actually taken from the Mantle Network to do our mantles. But this year, my teachers are over here, Nitika and Mansi. They also work with us at Joy of Drama. So we are planning to start mantles on historical contexts of India. And I think I'm really looking forward to this book, actually, to really start putting our Indian context and especially local history into the curriculum. That we create our own curriculum. So I want to put that in now.
Right.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Please share. We'd love to see them.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant.
There was an interesting point that Tim raised, of course, that in fact it's not just you're making adjustments all the time in different contexts with different cultures that you're dealing with in schools wherever you are. It's not just, okay, every school in India is one thing, and every school in Britain is different, and every classroom can be different as well. And you're always making those adjustments, I think, in terms of the context. So, and of course, Richard, maybe I can bring in Richard here. You've had experience of working in Palestine, haven't you?
Is that Helen next to you, Richard? I think it is.
It's me, Lisa.
Lisa, sorry. Lisa.
I think I've made many faux pas in my life, I can tell you, but one in Palestine in particular. I was starting a story with some children, and I wanted to start it with a helicopter landing at a hospital. So I drew the big H that you'd find on a helipad. I was drawing it, and I sort of felt this wasn't really going where I'd want it to go to, and that the children were looking more alarmed than interested. And it was because the children associated helicopters with oppressors rather than helicopters with people who will help and support them. So that point that was made earlier on about understanding the culture that you're working within is so important. Otherwise, you will put your foot right in it. And we worked our way around it, but we wouldn't have needed to had I thought more carefully about what I was doing there. So it was interesting.
Yeah,
so that's just one little anecdote.
So it's interesting if people have any thoughts on how the methods might change. We've had the example from Viv about the teaching role, the question of teaching role and embodiment. So any thoughts perhaps on this question about whether, we can see the content might need to change, but what about the methods themselves, or different nuances that can be brought out maybe in the way that they're used? Go on, Yona, yeah.
No, I quite like what Tim said earlier on about asking the children, how do we do things around here? How do we do things? I think that reflects quite a lot, I suppose, what Brian and I were sharing last week in a way about how it's about those particular children in that particular class. And it's about, it's about the practice we believe very strongly in, that it is inclusive and it matters to those children. So I think it's the same question in a way, but obviously you're highlighting things that will make us all consider and reconsider, I think, things we do without thinking. It just seems to me that it's about what do we believe teaching is, and is teaching about delivery? And I know we're all saying it's not, I know that. But we do, I think in schools, we can get into this habit of, that worked last week, I'll try it with this class this week, and that sort of thing. We all fall into the trap. I've fallen into that trap, certainly when I was. So I think there is that danger always. And I think what Viv and Tim are sharing today is reminding us that when we're teaching, whatever the cultures are, and there's like culture with a big C in terms of particular sensibilities to do with the culture, and then there's cultures, when I think about my NEET students in Port Albert, that's another kind of culture, but it's not it's the way they are, the way their lives are, the way they live.
Sorry, do you want to explain what NEET is? Because some people don't know that.
It's about marginalized students who are seen as not being able to be in education and training, who need help, and that's how they're labeled. But also it's about seeing them beyond who the I suppose the education system labels them as, seeing them beyond that label as well. So it seems to me that what Tim and Viv are emphasizing for me is that we really need to know our children. We really need to build those relationships. We really need to see each class as unique, and we need to see what they can bring to it. And of course, we need to step up and bring things that are connecting those classes where they're learning. So that's what it's, that's what it's doing for me as I'm listening to you. So I'm really grateful for that. So that's the point I'm making, really. And I think this idea of cultural advisors is a really good idea. It's something that maybe practically schools may look at, and I'd be very interested to hear how people can address all that as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say how important this book is. I think it raises so many important questions about culture that have tended to be sidelined or marginalized or even abused. I think of Dorothy's work at some time when it was sort of attacked misguidedly. Whereas I think what you've done is you've presented this really important question and put it front and center. And I love the way that the keys all have these two different approaches, because it immediately puts it into, it shows the dialogic nature, that there's not one way of doing it. There's always two, and there's always competing views. And I was just sitting here thinking, I'm from the north of Ireland, and I grew up in Derry, Londonderry, Dura, with its competing cultural and historical viewpoints on events in history. So I mean, we all know that one way or another, but just the idea that every classroom, every topic has got competing cultural viewpoints, if we can get into those, and of course, you can with dramatic inquiry in ways. And the other thing I wanted to say, just wanted to affirm what Fiona was saying there about the idea that you're not just inheriting a culture in the classroom. If you work with a group over time, you got a chance to create this culture that is our unique local classroom culture, and it needs to be responsive to who the actual students are in the room, including me. That all of that is important to be aware of, and it's a plus, because all of that brings multiple ways of looking at whatever it is we're looking at. So I just wanted to, this is a fantastic book and everybody should have it. And it raises really, really, really important questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. The book has not done its work though, until we've got a website full of work planning that's been created by teachers from all around the world, because here we are, two white English teachers representing, trying to make space for, and we would say in New Zealand, lift up others. And I'm just really conscious that here we are again, perpetuating that dominator, that it's like attending a conference about women's issues and all the presenters are men. I'm really, really aware of the absence of whakarongo in this space, and of Indigenous voices in this space. So the book itself is a key to try and open the door for more cross-cultural planning and more teaching by and about material that isn't just us, the dominant voices in education who have dominated for so long.
Manasi, you have your hand up.
Just to share, I can't, agree to what you said any less, because I had an experience in my own classroom. It's just a sharing of the experience of what I had with my students. And I come from north part of India, and, we stay in cities where we don't have streams. So I once shared this image of two ladies fishing from a stream, and you wanted to use that image with my students as a mantle. And I wanted to just, get them thinking about how life would be if people are fishing like that. And after 45 minutes, almost by the end of the class, I realized these guys have never done something like that. So all the responses were so fictional, so fictional. And I just kept on rolling around, giving them cues of what can be like that. And that's when I realized maybe I have just picked up something totally far off. And what they're giving me is, it's fine. Maybe this is what they could think of. So, that's when I realized that really connecting dots it's like something it wasn't easy for them at that time. And then in the next session, I got something, I would say, more industrial related, which I could gather that they could connect well with that. So I just want
Yeah,
I love that story.
that's a great example. Yeah.
What you've said about, the commonalities and, just phrasing the word distinctiveness versus difference, it makes so much sense because it's a shift of paradigm and the way we look at distinctiveness rather than differences. And placing culture as something that's so important for us to remember. And like Tim, when we talk about embodiment, I mean, I just had a teacher's workshop today, with a group of teachers who never thought that they could teach drama. And I was just saying that drama, when you do drama, you can be anyone, anything, anywhere, doing any kind of things. But now come to think about it, I must remember to go back to them on the second day of workshop to remind them about culture, being culturally sensitive about it, that we cannot, that there's certain cultures you can't really embody those things. And also the reminder about the planning as we rather than I alone, because I think teaching can be very lonely. And many teachers always plan in vacuum and see this as a very lonely endeavor. But I think the minute we look at planning together with someone who could give us different perspectives, I think that straight away, open up a lot more possibilities and reduce a lot of stress for a lot of teachers. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Elaine. And this is going to sound like a plug, but I think it's also building on what you've just said. Tim and I want to offer these planning support groups. They're going to be there for anyone who's bought the book. And I think they're monthly, aren't they, Tim? And we're going to go through key by key. And one of my hopes is that in that global community, we can give each other feedback and thoughts and say, well, that wouldn't work in my class, or, I'm thinking about my kids here. So that's another opportunity to keep that global sense of planning together. Yeah, so we're not alone.
They're going to be on the first Sunday of every month or something. Yeah, as much as we can. And there'll be two, one for Southern Hemisphere and one for the Northern Hemisphere. So we'll
that's
do.
My way to try and be inclusive.
So so I'll have to get up early and do one, and then do one in the afternoon, and Viv will do one in the evening, go to bed and do another one in the next morning. So we're trying to be as inclusive as we can so that everybody can come.
One of the final things just to maybe introduce at this point, one of the things you say in the book at the introduction, you're talking about time and teachers not feeling that they have much time. And I think there's commonalities and also maybe now across the world in terms of teachers and the pressures they're under. And this word time keeps coming back in to the point where this morning I was thinking maybe we should do a research project about time in the classroom and how you find time for things. So this is one of your concerns, wasn't it, in helping teachers because of the time pressures that they're all under now. And yet there's also this somehow, I don't know, maybe you can bring in this RJ15, whatever his name is, spy again, and just ask him about time in Woodrow. I mean, teachers are always talking about time. How come Woodrow can manage with these pressures of time and yet also continue with this imaginative and creative work? Because we have a system, really, don't we? And I think this is true around the world, which is squeezing creativity and imagination out of teaching.
To be honest, David, I sit on my arse in my office all the time. You leave it to Lisa to do. So.
Well, let's ask that question of Lisa then. Lisa saying no, I don't answer this.
I think you've got to be very, very. I mean, we have to teach so many things that the government demand that we teach now, and never before has it been like this with phonics. So. Yeah, I mean, Yona talks about being very creative with the time that remains, and I think you have to see the time that remains as, you know, golden nuggets that we must make the most of. So that's where we fit our Mantle work in. We work very hard on ensuring that there are links between the subjects. We work very hard in ensuring the curriculum is covered. And you want curious children, don't you? And you're not going to get curious children if you just sit them in front of a PowerPoint. So we make time, and we work hard to make time and create time.
Yeah, I think that teachers in England have sort of units of work that they find on the internet, or they buy a scheme, or, you know, they're given it. And that involves at least 6 hours worth of sitting in front of a PowerPoint and then writing something. So 6 hours of Mantle or drama in education is going to be brilliant, isn't it? Rather than 6 hours of sitting looking at the teacher. So yeah, there is time there, but obviously you've got to then, as the teacher, invest extra time to plan the Mantle. But once you do it, you see the difference in the children. You feel the difference in yourself and your classroom. So yeah, it's how you use the time. I know Yona keeps saying that, but I agree also with Richard that the time is squeezed, and I do agree that in Woodrow it's squeezed much more than it ever has been, because you do have things like phonics, computing, PE. There's like a reading framework now. You have to do book club, you have to do mastery maths, etc., etc. But there are those hours that you could use in a more creative way, definitely. And that's what we try to do, isn't it? Yeah. Forget the PowerPoint and let's get some, you know, a mannequin and a bag full of stuff, that kind of thing.
Viv, yeah, you put something in the chat. Do you want to unmute yourself and say this story that you told?
Sorry, I thought it was a way of talking without talking. Yeah, no, when I was working with the teachers last week, yeah, I quite like it at the end of a day when teachers go, you know, I thought I wasn't going to like this, because they often do that. They were saying, no, this felt like another thing. It felt like another thing on top of what we've got to do. But I can see what she was holding up. I can see how this is my writing program. I can see how this is my literacy, you know, and I think as Tim was saying before, it's not like we've in this book we've put anything that's radically different from what we've been doing in dramatic inquiry all these years, but we framed it in such a way that I think teachers can see a way in. You know, the teachers at Woodrow, teachers around the world who've been taught to cut keys, they know they can fit it into their everyday program, but hopefully this book is a entry point for those. Yeah, and it seems to be coming across that way, which is great. There's something about the way it's presented, the way that it's framed, the way that the keys are called those accessible things that, yeah, these teachers the other day were going, oh, I'm going to do this now because it's not another thing on top. Teachers don't need another thing on top. They can't. But what they need is some suggestions for how to do the things they do in a more engaging way.
Yeah, because I was somebody told me a story. I put this in the Facebook group the other day. It was about a teacher in a school there were 3 of them all teaching English, program of English in primary schools, and this one teacher was always falling behind the other 2. The other 2 were keeping up with the schedule, and she was always falling behind. And the other 2 were seen as excellent teachers by the school, and she was seen as a failing teacher. And she looked at what was going on, why this was the case. And it was because every time they had a writing task, the children, she was trying to get them to be creative in their writing, and the other 2 teachers were writing the story up on the board, and the kids were simply copying it into their books. And that's what I mean about creativity being squeezed out of the curriculum, out of education, and this kind of the cop in the head for teachers now. There's this cop in the head. Oh, we've got to get this done. We've got to do this, and we've got to achieve these targets all the time. And but I think these comments that we're getting in the chat, like Brian's saying it, and Viv, you were saying as well, it's about doing it, but doing it in a way that really makes it. It's what you value. You're doing what you value, and you're doing it in a way that engages the kids as well. And that's what we've got to try and do, absolutely, in this sometimes crazy system that we're living in, but we're dealing with.
First of all, thank you for bringing us together. I'm in Turkey, and just I would like to say, how can we balance self and other in dramatic context? I mean, because teacher also in need of culturally accepted and culturally covered in the dramatic context. And sometimes I'm starting with story in my classroom. Some Muslim students doesn't want to get enrolled, especially if I use a story from Bible. Sometimes I say, once upon a time, there was a man like drinking wine. Sometimes students refusing to get enrolled and say it is, even if it's fiction, it's fictional context, but I don't want to do it. It's not right for me. But is it, I think it's a bit censorship. It's not ethical way to cut it off and take it off from the story or context. And I need to bring them different cultures and different minds. And if I'm not Muslim as a drama teacher, I need to be involved in the group, and that's also mind drama. And I need to experience the dramatic actions, events in same context. I can't get lost of the story, I think, as me, as Ruken, as drama teacher, I think. It's not an ethical way to cut and replace with the groups normals and with the groups cultural symbols, I think. Yeah, that's just I want to say and share with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruken. That's really interesting.
Oh, can I jump in? Can I jump in? I just love what you just shared with us, Ruken. Thank you so much, because I think that's a perfect example where the children are responding to content. They think they're responding. I don't want to put thoughts into their head, but I think my perception of what was going on there was they think that's about context, but it's also about how they're being asked to engage with that context. So I just remember this conversation with Warren, and this is so fantastic, the way this gets us thinking, right? You're right, it's not ethical to go, right, we're not going to do that story at all, and it's not ethical to go, right, I will completely change everything I'm doing to, but there are ways, there are middle grounds. So what, for example, what if instead of embodying the person who is taking wine in that story, the children are invited to think of the dimensions of imagination at that time? So this is a story about a person drinking wine. I wonder what the sounds are in the room. I wonder what's still. I wonder what's moving. I think it's an issue there of how we engage with the context. And the resistance might not come to the same extent if it's about painting a picture of the scene. I also think that it's an incredibly brave thing for a student to say no in a classroom. This is how I've done some of my learning, is where children have gone, don't ask me to do that. Not to me, but to a fellow teacher who told me the story, and I think, you know, it's really brave for a child to do that, and it sets up a dialogue. So I'm not saying there's an easy answer to that, but these are exactly the questions of practice and problems of practice that we need to get together, talk about, replan, retry, come back and talk again. And I just wonder whether something like our key that's called Step Into a Moment, where you deliberately do not step into the moment, as a group, you imagine stepping into the moment, but you don't embody anybody. You instead, the teacher does some embodying, but instead the children think about the sights and sounds and movements and stillness and darkness and light in that moment to step into it aesthetically rather than embody. That sort of key could be one to try in that kind of scenario. I just love what you shared with us there. Thank you, Rukin. And I'm not trying to solve it, but I want to engage in that conversation some more.
Thank you, Rukin. That was so interesting, as Viv says. And yeah, that's very interesting what you were talking about, Viv, just at the end, about different ways of immersing yourself in the story or the moment. But what I was wondering, it just made me think of classrooms in London as well, and different experiences that I've had in London. Whereas Viv was saying you might encounter some kind of reluctance. I wondered whether it was to do with perceptions about acting and role play. Is that what you thought, taking on the role? Or was it to do with the suspension of disbelief or imagining you're in somewhere else? So I just I wondered which of those.
Or was it a cultural thing? Because I imagine you said they were Muslim, and they didn't want to imagine drinking wine. So there's a religious, cultural dimension to it as well. Is that right, Rukin?
Yes.
Oh, so it was to do with wine. It wasn't to do with the role play.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. They are refusing to get enrolled as a wine drinker. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
but that's the story.
Right, yeah, but I wouldn't now I used to do dramas, and maybe they met in the local pub. I would never do that now so things like that. Yeah, I can understand that. I thought it was. I wondered if it was to do with also just that the acting, the role play, was that also something that was inhibiting or not particularly. It wasn't.
We need study groups with kids where we ask them these questions.
We need to find out more.
Bring them into Zoom calls and talk to them about their resistance and help them to help us to learn and to teach better.
One of the things, sorry, just to talk, one of the things that Viv and I, in terms of the things that we were writing, we were thinking about how to protect children into experiences. So there's an awful lot of the steps that we've created in the sequences in the keys are about what language you can use in order to protect children, particularly if they're not familiar with being in role. And we talk as a piece in the back of the book where we talk about subjects like that, and there's a whole list of sort of pieces of advice for how and what the sort of challenges you might encounter if because I was working with a group of year 7s and 8s on Monday, and it was a big challenge for them. It's a big challenge to stand up and represent somebody else, and just for a moment. There's lots of feelings there that are common, I'm sure, about feeling silly or pretending or doing something that draws ridicule or shame. So it's a lot of the keys that we use where we are asking the children to represent people within a fiction are couched within the kinds of language that you can use in order to, and the kinds of strategies like the ones that Viv was talking about that can help children take what Dorothy used to call edge in, to just kind of feel protected and safe in order to, and then they find themselves in it, even without even realizing that they are, they're sort of in it. So there's a lot of that kind of guidance. In fact, it was one of the sort of main sort of things that we were trying to aim for, was to communicate that kind of language that you can use, and we've learned through experience and learning from other people like Brian and others.